Hey, and welcome back to another episode of Interesting History after an extended summer break. Now, since there's been a sudden rise in media interest on neo-national socialist groups, especially in the United States, we thought it would be fair to take a look at the most infamous Nazi party of all time. Yes, today's episode will be all about the Nationalsozialistische Arbeiterpartei Deutschlands, or the NSDAP, and the empire it created. But rather than talking about the often heard tales of its glory days, mind you that's in apostrophes, or the Allied stories after the turning of the tide in the European theater of World War II, we'll be looking at the last phase of the Reich that was designed to last 1,000 years. My name is Isaac, and this is the German perspective on the final gambles and eventually the downfall of the Third Reich. Now, I'd like to start off by saying that this is a very complex subject, which we won't be able to cover in one or two videos, so I definitely encourage you to research more on this topic if you're interested in it. Additionally, some of the numbers and facts we give in this video may be slightly off, since while the Nazi bureaucracy was known to be very meticulous, many members of the system went long ways to destroy these documents in the last days of the war. So much of what we know about the German war machine today is based off of Allied estimates. Anyways, by the beginning of December 1944, the general situation wasn't looking very good for Nazi Germany, and, quick spoiler alert, it wasn't going to get better anytime soon. German armies had been in constant retreat against the Soviets on the Eastern Front for about 2 years now, and by August 1944, the Soviets had managed to push all the way to the outskirts of the remains of the ex-Polish capital of Warsaw, and to the border of the German homeland in East Prussia. In the same month, the Germans had lost virtually all their possessions in the Balkans to a major Russian offensive, including the oil fields of Romania, which were vital to the German war effort and industry. However, the remainder of the Eastern Front stayed relatively stable in the last half of 1944, since the Russians had decided to delay their offensive on Berlin into the beginning of the next year. In the West, the Allies had, after their infamous landings at Normandy, finally broken the German resistance in northern France by late August, and managed to steamroll all the way to the German pre-war fortifications of the Westwall along the French border, which had recently been put back into use in the face of an Allied offensive into the German heartland. Yet just like on the Eastern Front, the Allied forces had been stopped by October, after they had finally taken the first major German city of Aachen after heavy fighting. Fun fact: while many people know about the German steamroll of France in 1940, which only took 7 weeks to conquer the whole of the country and is called a massive defeat for the French and English military, did you know that the Allies reconquered the majority of France in just 3 weeks after breaking out of the Normandy pocket? I guess you could say someone was salty. Meanwhile, by winter 1944, the Allies had won the air war over Europe. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had lost large amounts of pilots, plane production had plummeted due to Allied bombing, and the air raids had destroyed much of Germany's synthetic oil refineries, meaning that the planes that the Germans still had couldn't even take off. The Germans' lack of oil in the last months of the war is one of the main reasons Germany's army and industry just couldn't keep going anymore, thus drastically shortening the war for the Allies in Europe. Additionally, most of the German transportation system and industry had been completely wiped out, thus further exacerbating the German war situation. Much of the industry was relocated to underground, including many of the East European forced laborers who were working there, which then suffered in even worse conditions than before. At the same time, the German Wehrmacht was underlying some serious manpower shortages. In order to combat this, the German High Command in October 1944 issued orders to raise a German People's Army, or the Volkssturm, which consisted of old men, teens, and men which had previously been deemed unfit to fight. In propaganda, this was displayed as a brave uprising of the German population against the evil advancing capitalists and Bolsheviks, and as a sign that the war would soon turn in Germany's favor again. Yet most of these units were under-equipped, and many older members lacked any fighting morale. Younger members, however, often born in the years 1927 through 1929, fought very fanatically, as they had lived in the Nazi dictatorship for most of their life, and desperately wanted to defend it at all costs. Believe it or not, Reich Minister Joseph Goebbels even proposed a plan to recruit women under 30 into the army, yet the plan was blocked by Hitler. In all, over 700 Volkssturm divisions ever saw combat, yet only few actually succeeded in boosting the German war effort, and in many occasions the Germans' will to fight was even further lowered, since the sending away of these ragtag units of old men and young boys to the front was seen as a reflection of the Nazi leadership's desperateness. Anyways, in December 1944, many of these Volkssturm units hadn't been sent to the front, as the fight hadn't reached the German heartland just quite yet. And Adolf Hitler, Führer of the German Reich, even believed that since both fronts, West and East, had stopped advancing further into the Reich, it was now time for Germany to use this opportunity to strike back. Mind you, almost all of Germany's senior military command disagreed with the idea of launching an offensive, as Germany was heavily outnumbered, out-equipped, and for the most part demobilized due to the lack of oil, and completely without air superiority. Yet Hitler insisted, and the area in the Ardennes forest along the Belgian and Luxembourg border, which was only loosely defended by the Allies, was chosen as the starting grounds of the attack. The offensive named Watch on the Rhine was supposed to throw the Allies off guard, reconquer Brussels and the important Allied supply port of Antwerp, whilst encircling British and Canadian troops in northern Belgium. If this initial attack succeeded, or even if it didn't, other divisions in the southern part of the front would then advance. In Hitler's imagination, he would then be able to crush the Allies in France and then in turn focus on the Soviets. Mass amounts of equipment and resources were amassed along the Ardennes sector, including over 400,000 men and 1,200 tanks. Many of these men and much of the equipment needed to launch an offensive in the west was stripped from German units in the east, thus leaving large parts of the front there completely exposed. Yet Hitler counted on the fact that the Soviets would still wait to launch any offensives until the new year. On December 16, 1944, the Germans attacked in the cover of heavy fog, which gave them the advantage of protection from Allied air support. The offensive did indeed catch the Allies by surprise, yet none of the major objectives were ever reached. Within days, the offensive got bogged down, with only the center sector of the German attack even coming close to any significant territorial gains. A large bulge around 60 miles deep was created in the Allied lines, thus giving the offensive its English nickname, the Battle of the Bulge. Due to quick reinforcements by supplies and men, tough resistance, most notably in the Belgian town of Bastogne, and eventually the disappearance of the fog, which exposed the advancing German troops to the Allied Air Force, all led to the culmination of the offensive by Christmas Eve 1944. In reality, there was never a chance that the Germans could have reconquered France against the numerous, well-supplied, and well-supported troops of the Allies, especially since the Germans barely had enough oil to keep their offensive moving. The Allies soon began a counterattack, and by late January, all lands taken by the Germans in their attack were in Allied control again. Hitler, however, in his maniacal mind, demanded the small remainder of the once so great Luftwaffe to regain air superiority in a decisive maneuver named Operation Bodenplatte, mainly by bombing Allied airstrips throughout the Low Countries and France. Thus, on January 1st, the Luftwaffe, with about 1,000 hastily gathered planes, although highly outnumbered and low on fuel, started its last-ditch attempt. The attack did score some successes, yet soon the Germans sustained heavy losses, which they definitely couldn't afford, and thus by the end of the attack, the German Luftwaffe ceased to be a significant fighting force. Altogether, the attacks of December and January had drained German resources and manpower on the Western Front as well as the Eastern Front. And on January 12th, the Soviets began their offensive. Within weeks, they had pushed to the modern-day Czech border and to the Oder River. Only a minor German counterattack in Pomerania convinced the Soviet commanders to wait to attack Berlin. In their wake, the Soviets had not only inflicted massive casualties on the Germans, making January 1945 the deadliest month of the war so far for the Germans, they had also taken large portions of ethnic German lands. Many Germans, fearing retribution by the Red Army for the horrors the Wehrmacht and the SS had participated in Russia, fled west during one of the coldest modern European winters. They were accompanied by the survivors of German concentration camps in Poland, which the German government had ordered to evacuate, thus many people died on the way into the heart of Germany. Additionally, the Soviet offensive managed to capture the largest intact industrial area the Germans still possessed, in Upper Silesia, which according to Reichs Armaments Minister Albert Speer, reduced the German armaments industry by 70%. In the midst of this precarious situation, there was however still some hope among Hitler's inner circle. Hitler himself still believed, and not even that unrealistically, that the enemy coalition of the Soviets and the Allies would still break up, and Germany would then be able to choose a side. Other voices in Berlin, most notably Joseph Goebbels, believed that this wasn't going to happen on its own, and that the Reich should try to reach out to one side, preferably the Allies, in order to make a separate peace. Hitler, however, decisively struck down any peace initiatives, stating that Germany should wait to become diplomatic until the situation was once again looking in its favor, or else it would be seen as a last desperate move by the Führer. As such, none of these plans ever came to fruition. By the beginning of February, small-scale defense preparations had begun in Berlin, modeled after the Soviet defenses the Wehrmacht had had to fight in Moscow and Leningrad. Yet Hitler still favored a so-called forward defense of the city, as he wanted to avoid the dropping of civilian morale at all costs. In general, one may add though, civilian morale was never high in the first place. A Swedish ambassador who visited Berlin in February 1945 had this to say. Berlin seemed war-weary, the people looked fairly well-fed, and though there were long queues outside food shops, in the end customers apparently got what they wanted. There was no real shortage of food, but people gave the impression of being utterly sick of the war and completely dominated by the wish to see it end quickly. Yet later he also states, a large part of the population clung sentimentally to the Führer right up to the end. They felt their oath of allegiance binding on them. Adolf Hitler's fantastic dreams, which to other nations were nightmares, had become the Germans' wishful thinking. Hitler himself had largely remained out of the public eye for the last few years, with him even described by his closest companions as having an incomprehensible fear of the microphone. This could be attributed to Hitler's physical and even psychological state, which can only be described as deteriorating. Thus it was up to propaganda minister Goebbels to improve the general mood, and he did this by comparing the German situation to that of the Romans in the Second Punic War, who, despite initial heavy losses, came out victorious in the end against their opponent Carthage. Additionally, the topic of anti-Semitism was raised in an article by Goebbels once again, titled "We Mustn't Let the Topic Be Forgotten." The atrocities committed by the advancing Soviets against the German population were also reported in order to increase the fighting spirit of the population. Indeed, this worked, as the Soviets encountered much more fierce resistance in their campaign into Germany as the Allies did. Another thing the German propaganda used to increase spirit was the Wunderwaffen program. These German wonder weapons were mostly put to use during the late stages of the war as part of the Nazi leadership's idea to crush the overwhelming, better equipped enemy with advanced technology. But you'll have to wait for that until our next episode. All in all, things were not looking good for Germany by the end of February 1945. They were low on resources, the industry had been destroyed, manpower-wise they were scraping the barrel, and German cities lay in flames due to Allied bombing raids. As a result, many Nazi officials were starting to fear for their lives. They began questioning allegiances, disobeying orders, and cracking down harder than ever before on people who were perceived to be traitors. All of this will be the topic of our next video, so join us then when we discuss the final hours and the end of the Reich, and all the horror and more than often relief that came with it. Thanks for watching Interestivity. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe, and enjoy our other videos right now.